Wanted to welcome everybody today to Engineering Camp. My name is Pat Mather. I'm the Dean of Engineering here, and I'd like my colleagues from the college to introduce themselves. Kenny, do you want to start?
Sure. Hi, everybody. I'm Professor Kenny Mineart. I'm a professor in chemical engineering.
Dr. Wakabayashi?
Hi, good morning, everybody. My name is Kat Wakabayashi, and I'm also a professor in chemical engineering. Welcome.
Hi, everybody. I'm Associate Dean Jablonski, but I am also a chemical engineer. And this is not meant to be an engineering camps exclusively for chemical engineers. It's just Monday. Pat also happens, Dean Mather, also happens to be a chemical engineer. So you're going to get a pretty exclusive shot on the first day. Before we get started, there's just some ground rules I want to put out for you guys. As you know, I've been the director of engineering camp, you probably saw on the website, for a lot of years, and every year we welcome a whole bunch of campers to campus with their parents, and they get a tour and they get to check out our labs and they get to meet our counselors and do things throughout the week. So of course we're sad that you can't be there, can't be here. Well, actually, we're not even there. Only a few of us are. Half of us have to be at home. So I am really happy to see the number of participants we have today. And I know that a lot of people are going to watch this afterwards. So you all know that we're holding these sessions via Zoom, and we are going to record those. So if you want to stay video muted, that's totally fine. Todd will also keep everyone audio muted while the other professors are presenting, so that we have good, clear audio. This isn't perfect. I know a lot of you have probably had to do this for your fourth marking period. It's no substitute for being in person and getting hands-on during instruction. But we'll make the best of it and we'll get to know each other. One of the things that I really want to point out, and it's a particular time in the engineering profession and in our world, is that so yeah, engineers design and implement solutions to problems, global problems, design problems, infrastructure problems, medical problems, all kinds of issues are addressed by engineers. But we know that systemic inequality is a problem that pervades all aspects of society. And to be an effective engineer, to really be a responsible global citizen, it requires that all of us are actively and intentionally inclusive. So during these sessions, we are going to endeavor to create a learning environment that supports diversity of thought, perspectives and experiences, and honors our identities. So please be respectful of all the instructors and fellow campers. And the best way we want to be able to start to interact before we open up for questions at the end is that you can use the chat function, and Todd, again, will be monitoring that chat function, or you can use the raise hand. You can chat out questions, chat with each other. If you wanted to say, oh, that's cool, I haven't seen that before, what was that again? Or can you show that again, or something like that? We'll make sure that we can get material to you. The other thing we're going to make available to you is we will have more sessions later in the summer for anyone who thinks that this is an okay medium for just checking out Bucknell and our instructors. And we'll post links to some of the admissions materials, which are, whether or not you want to go to Bucknell, but just if you want to check out campus and check out our buildings and check out our labs. So we'll put all of those resources up, and we'll let you know as we post those resources. So I'm going to hand it back to Dean Mather now to get started on the formal presentation. Welcome, everybody. Pat, you're muted. That's my trick.
Thank you. That took me exceptionally long that time. So welcome, everybody. Today, we're going to talk about cool things related to chemical engineering, molecules, and materials. Before we go there, I wanted to give you a little bit of overview of what is engineering anyways, and what is engineering at Bucknell. So we put together just a few slides for that part, and then we'll dive into the more technical aspect of today's camp session. So what you see on this first slide is a picture of Dana. This is our building, the original engineering building at Bucknell. It has, it's huge. It has a lot of really cool labs. And here on this slide, I introduce the types of engineering that you can study at many universities, including at Bucknell. We have things that range from biomedical engineering to mechanical. These are majors you've probably heard of. Our newest is environmental engineering, which gets into sustainability. And then we have some combined programs that combine either, for example, mechanical engineering and art, if you're interested in both worlds, or any engineering major and management. The question is, though, that might be on your mind for some of you, and for even practicing engineers, is what do engineers do exactly? And so I put together sort of this word cloud of different things. One that I think distinguishes very good engineers is finding problems. This is about, if you're working for a company, seeking out opportunities where what you as a company might solve a problem, which gets to the other part of what engineers do, is solving problems. And that doesn't mean doing a calculation necessarily. It might mean many other more creative things. One of the reasons I was drawn to engineering is I love to do research, and I love to just ask big questions. And sometimes those lead to discoveries, and that's why many engineers are themselves inventors by like what they would say about what they do. They invent things. We also like to tinker, and you might find when you get a job as an engineer that the equivalent of 1 day a week is just tinkering around in the lab to see what you can create that's new and interesting. For example, there's a company called 3M in Minnesota that has a very direct policy: 1 day a week or 2 half days. Just spend time in the lab and see what you can uncover. Engineering is not a solo effort. Everything we do in engineering, it involves a collaboration. And so working with other engineers or other non-engineers. We get to travel the world. Most engineering jobs involve travel around the country or internationally. And that's something I very much enjoy, as do our alumni that are out there in corporate America. You get to work on a team. You design stuff from scratch, even if it never existed before. That's the job of the engineer, is to imagine something that doesn't exist. There was a time when iPhones did not exist, and an engineer had the great idea to create that product. You get to learn every day. When I think back to when I was in high school and then in college, I thought, oh my God, my brain is basically full already. But now that I look back, now that I'm into my career as an engineer, I learn things every day, and that makes things exciting. And you get to, and this is sort of bottom line, as an engineer, you get to build tomorrow. Scientists and humanists, and philosophers, they kind of dream about what tomorrow might be. Engineers, we actually build it and make it a reality. So this is all pretty exciting. Dean Jablonski?
Yeah, so before entering the dean's office this past year, I was a faculty member for 15 years, and I can definitely attest to the fact that we are all about engaging students, doing things hands-on, whether it's in the lab or outside, whether it's getting messy or just frankly having a good time, because it's all about being engaging. So we have most of our required courses have a laboratory component with them. And in that laboratory component, it is very common that you will work in a group to complete some project or some experiments and get really good at writing technical reports as well. The other thing that we do is we're just all about hands-on. Here you can see people building either a design project, doing a collaborative project in Engineering 100. If we see on the next slide, this is the Gizmo project here in the middle, which is an expo that usually happens at the end of your first engineering course, which is a course that introduces you to multiple disciplines and helps you select which major you'd like to do. A lot of this is happening in our maker spaces. Just here's some more images. We just get in it, although that person probably should be wearing some eye protection, but we're in the machines, we're with the tools. That's you know, some of our favorite stuff to do. And we everything from you saw mechanical to chemical to electrical to most recently that was environmental. We across all disciplines, a lot of hands-on experiences. We're really into making at Bucknell. We have the Makery, which is part of the electrical and computer engineering department, but we have other maker spaces across campus, whether it's laser cutters or 3D printers or 3D scanners, so you can 3D print a thing that you want to duplicate. If you don't already know how to solder, no problem. Someone's there to teach you how to solder, teach you how to 3D print, teach you how to laser cut, teach you how to cut vinyl, anything you can imagine, rendering any 3D object into real life. And most importantly, there should be a purpose, right? Engineers do what engineers do for the benefit of society, period. It's in all of our codes of ethics. It should be the understanding. If you want to do something good for society, engineering is a great way to accomplish that. So the National Academy of Engineers established these grand challenges years ago, and now it's become the global grand challenges. Bucknell was one of the first programs. I think we were program 8 in the world. But this is now implemented at engineering schools worldwide. And it allows you to think about your curriculum, your research, some entrepreneurial experience, some service learning. So you go out into the community, you might have called it civic engagement or community service in high school, and do what you do and apply your talents for a purpose, for the benefit of society.
All right. So another thing we do in engineering at Bucknell is we collaborate with companies, particularly in what we call senior capstone design. And so shown on this slide are projects with the company Keurig Dr. Pepper, where our students worked with project engineers at that company to make the next generation coffee maker designs. And then on the left, we have students working with a medical device company where in a class, they were working with engineers at that company to improve medical device design. So it's really cool. You get to apply what you're learning in the classroom to a real world environment. And that makes it an excellent opportunity to get exposure to what it's really going to be like to be an engineer, and maybe even get a job interview out of that experience. Here's the wide variety of companies we've worked with, companies that you probably recognize, some that you might not recognize, including, ones that are noteworthy are Amazon Robotics, Johnson & Johnson, and there'll be a little bit more on robotics later in our technical part of the presentation. We're very proud of our ranking nationally. We're 6th in the country for College of Engineering like us, and our particular departments or programs that you could engage with as a student are also very highly ranked. So a little bit about myself in more detail, since I'll be presenting the part of the technical part today. I'm an engineer, but that's what I do for my day job. I'm also very interested in guitar. It's what I do when I'm not being an engineer. I love movies, and I'm really looking forward to the beach. It's going to be a little bit different this summer, but my family and I, every year since I was a kid, go to South Jersey. We love Seattle City in particular. And I'll turn it over to Professor Mineart, who will introduce himself. And sure. In fact, I'm going to let you share your slides right after this slide, just so you know.
Okay. Hi, everybody. So again, I'm Professor Kenny Mineart in chemical engineering. And I actually, as my introduction, want to speak for about a minute, my path to engineering, because I feel like we all once were in your shoes. And so I kind of just want to give you an idea of where I came from. And so growing up, I played a lot of sports. Math and science came easily, but really in middle school and high school, I was 4-sport athlete, something like 12 varsity letters in high school or something. I don't even remember, but very into sports. And then I transitioned. I played college basketball for a couple of years, and I transitioned into engineering and found that I like it even more than sports. It started with interest in math and science. And kind of a leap of faith to transition from basketball to chemical engineering. And then I haven't looked back since then. I really, truly love chemical engineering. And I guess I'll say I still run and do a lot of cycling now. So I haven't lost all of my excitement for sports, but definitely engineering takes more of the front line now.
Okay.
All right, I'll share sound. All right, so as has already been mentioned, please, if you guys have any questions, this is going to be as interactive as you make it, so feel free to interrupt. I'll try to keep an eye out for chat questions. If you have those, type them in. I'm happy to reshare the videos or whatever. This is always more fun if it's more interactive, so please make that happen if you want. So Dean, Matta, and I are doing the first technical session. And this, I think, may have changed a little bit since you got the announcement for the engineering camp, but the topic is still basically the same. And we're going to be talking about smart molecules and smart materials. And so the first part of that is kind of the part I'm going to cover, which is smart molecules. And this is something I work at Bucknell, which we'll get into. But when we say smart molecules, what are we actually talking about? We're going to watch a short video here in a minute that I can provide the YouTube link if people want that. But when I say smart molecules, there's a lot of molecules that actually arrange themselves. And this is a process called self-assembly. As the name implies, the molecules assemble themselves. We don't have to really do anything to make them assemble. They just kind of, the laws of chemistry and physics make that happen. And this is kind of how we come to exist, as we'll see in this video. So I'll play this. I think maybe Pat or Aaron, let me know if the audio is not coming through. I think it should be set up to come through right.
Imagine a puzzle where the pieces fit themselves together without any human help. These special kinds of puzzles are actually all around us, on a scale we normally can't see, and they put themselves together in a process called self-assembly. Self-assembly occurs when molecules spontaneously organize into complex structures, like smart puzzle pieces. They are directed to their proper locations by attractions and repulsions that result from their electrical charges, magnetic properties, and complementary shapes. This means that the molecules can assemble spontaneously into ordered rods, sheets, spheres, and other useful structures that are much bigger than the individual building blocks. One of these useful structures self-assembles every time you wash your hands. Soap is made up of molecules called fatty acids. These molecules have a hydrophilic end that's attracted to water and a hydrophobic chain that's attracted to oily substances like grease and dirt. When you wash your hands, the large hydrophobic chains cluster around the particles of grease and dirt, leaving the hydrophilic end sticking out, surrounded by water. This self-assembled dirt trap helps the water pull grease and dirt off your hands and leaves your skin squeaky clean. Remember that self-assembly organizes material at a very small scale. In fact, the molecules involved in self-assembly are often measured in units of nanometers, or a billionth of a meter. That's 1,000 times smaller than a human hair. This makes self-assembly especially useful for nanotechnologies, which are found in everything from computer chips to electric cars to medical technology. Speaking of medical technology, one example of self-assembly in action is a new method for getting medicine to the right places in sick patients, a field known as drug delivery. Researchers have found a way to make thin molecular coatings self-assemble around small doses of anti-cancer drugs, similar to how soap molecules surround an oily substance. These coatings help the assembly bind selectively to cancer cells and release most of the drug when it gets to those cells, where it can do the most good. This also protects healthy cells from being attacked by the anti-cancer drug. Remember the hydrophobic tails and hydrophilic ends of the soap molecule? Nature uses similar building blocks called phospholipids in the outer membrane of each one of your cells. These building blocks contain one hydrophilic end attached to two hydrophobic tails. These pieces self-assemble into a bilayer, sort of like a nanoscale ice cream sandwich. The center ice cream part of the bilayer maximizes hydrophobic interactions between the long tails and positions of the hydrophilic end cookies in contact with watery environments inside or outside the cell. The formation of this phospholipid bilayer keeps important cellular components like the nucleus and cytoplasm where they belong, so that they can do what they're supposed to do, where it's supposed to happen. This is one of the many interacting bits and pieces that come together to make what's arguably the most beautiful and intricate example of self-assembly in nature. You.
Okay, so there's kind of an overview of self-assembly. Now I want to get into a couple of things. I have a couple of things you can do here. You don't have to do them right now. Obviously, that'll be pretty hard, but a couple of things you can do. This first one is a way, as you saw in the video, these things that self-assemble they're molecules, right? So the puzzle pieces that they talked about at the beginning of that video are actually individual molecules that are extremely tiny. And so we can't really see them obviously with our naked eye, but even with regular microscopes, they're way too small to see with a microscope you might have used in a high school like chemistry lab or a middle school biology looking at cells. But there is a way that we can kind of indirectly see them. And so this experiment is looking at those fatty acid collections, which we also call micelles. They didn't call that in the video. But the assembly of the fatty acids around dirt, for example, is big enough that it diffracts light. And so in this experiment, if you get a couple of clear bottles, you can get these travel size soap bottles that you might buy to go for a flight somewhere. Fill one with pure water, one with some water, and then you can use hand soap. Pump the hand soap in there, make sure it's well mixed before you do this. You'll kind of see it when it's not mixed, so make sure you get it well mixed. And then you can shine a laser pointer into each and observe. And before I play this video, I'm gonna show you what happens. So this is just a kind of a binary case, one without soap, one with soap. But you could actually play around with how much soap you're adding and see what kind of effect, or you could even hypothesize what kind of effect that might have and then see if you're right. So I'm gonna, oh shoot, sorry. I'm gonna mute this video and talk over it. So again, this is our couple of bottles here. The one with the blue lid is the pure water. The one with the pink lid, as you can see, I just shook it up to mix it up a little bit, is the soapy water. Something else to be careful about in this experiment is you want to make sure all the bubbles are actually out of the liquid part. So if you shake up soap, you know it's going to make a bunch of bubbles. You don't want to see the diffraction of the light off the bubbles. Okay, there's my laser pointer. And this is actually called the Tyndall effect. But the laser pointer, I'm showing you to point it in the center here. So don't overlook that. But if you shine it through the water, this is pure water, you kind of don't really see anything. You see some of the green on the sides where it's diffracting off the plastic bottle, but actually in the solution, you don't see anything happening. And then here in a minute, I'm gonna move this over to the soapy solution. And this is where you'll be able to see the actual collections of fatty acids. And if they were dissolved like sugar in water, you still wouldn't see any diffraction, but because they're assembled into little units, you can see there's a laser line right through the soapy water there. And that's because the light is being diffracted by the little collections of fatty acids in soap water. So that's something you can do. Again, you can vary the amount of soap and see what kind of effect that has as kind of an addition to this experiment. Okay. But what we're really focused on, so fatty acids, even phospholipids that I talked about in the video, those are relatively small molecules. And the focus of today, this session and the one for this afternoon, are polymers and plastics. And so I want to take a minute to define what those are before we go into the self-assembly of polymers or plastics. And so maybe some of you have heard of polymers before, and directly defined, a polymer means many units. So these are molecules that are built of many units that are typically the same. And they're really, really big, which we'll talk about in a second. And I'm sure you probably all have heard, or most of you have heard of the term plastic. Polymers and plastics are two different things, okay? And that's not to say they aren't, they can't be, one thing can't be made of polymers and plastics, but the terminology is different. And so I want you to take care, if you use these words, in using them correctly. A plastic is a material, so describe something that's big, right? My phone here is a big piece of material. This might be plastic, the case might be plastic. The term polymer refers to the actual molecules. Okay, so we're talking about the characterization of a single molecule, whereas plastic is talking about the material collectively. Something else to be aware of, all plastics are polymers. And so if you have anything that you know is plastic, whether it's maybe some safety glasses or again, like a phone case, you know it's plastic, it's definitely made of polymers. But on the other hand, there are certain polymers that don't act as plastics. Okay, so examples there might be sugar or DNA. We don't typically think of DNA as being a plastic material. Your whole body being made of plastic probably makes you cringe a little bit, given plastic in the ocean and things that are going on currently. but those molecules are polymers because they're really large and they're made of many units. So I like to do this analogy because it's really hard to think about atoms and molecules and say, oh, that's really big or that's really small in the context of our eyes or our perception. And so a couple of examples I use are, you can think about a ruler or a paperclip as being a single unit. So this is a molecule maybe like the size of water, H2O, or if you're familiar with a little more complex chemistry, something like ethane, C2H6. Okay, so that single repeating unit or that single building block, we're now going to expand out and say each of them is a foot long or each of them is a paperclip long. Okay, now when we say really large molecules, if we make a polymer from each of these units, if we do the ruler example, a foot long, a polymer built of ruler units is basically 4 round trips from Lewisburg, where I sit currently, all the way to LA and back 4 times, right? So huge compared to a ruler. The paperclip example, unfortunately, again, we're not in person. What I generally like to do is build a paperclip chain to emphasize this point and ask, how many paperclips do we think is a polymer? Many repeating units. What does that mean? And I eventually end up with a chain that's 200 paperclips long. But that's not even close to a polymer. These are huge molecules. You could build a paperclip chain to go all the way around a 1/4 mile track. And that, in that case, is still a pretty small polymer molecule. So hopefully this is becoming clear that these are huge molecules. Another way we like to look at them, so this gives you an idea of scale, when they sit in materials, especially ones that are what we're called amorphous or not crystalline, we like to think about polymers kind of like a bowl of pasta. They're really long chains where each noodle is a molecule, and they're kind of just random. They don't have any order. They're kind of just like all mixed together like pasta noodles, or spaghetti noodles, I should say. And so this kind of defines polymers. Now, again, back to the topic of today, smart polymers assemble into geometries different than this bowl of pasta. The molecules can arrange themselves into certain shapes. And so on this slide, I just give you a few examples. I already talked about how DNA is a polymer. And so if you think about a single nucleic acid being like a pasta noodle, if we have 2 complementary nucleic acids that come together and form a DNA, we all know really well, because it's well documented at this point, and we teach it pretty early on in science, that they form a double helix, like I've shown here. And so that's an example of a self-assembling polymer, or in this case, 2 self-assembling polymers together. The center is a picture of, it's a ball and stick model, but anyways, the chains you see here that are kind of running vertically in the top picture are polymer chains, and these are no longer like a bowl of spaghetti. These are arranged perfectly complementary to one another, and they stack in almost perfect sequence, and this is what makes polymers crystalline. You might have talked about liquids and solids. As far as like water goes, water is a liquid, and then it freezes and it becomes ice, and that's a solid. Polymers can be a solid that's not ordered or not assembled, or they can crystallize and form a self-assembled set of polymer chains. So that's also a form of polymer self-assembly. The last example on the right is a really complex structure called a gyroid. And in this case, I believe this is even might be a double gyroid. We have the ability to synthesize, so not DNA, not nucleic acids that our body produce, but in a lab or in a factory, produce polymers that have very specific chemistry so that they can form these complicated patterns on a really small scale. Like the video said, 1,000 times smaller than a human hair. And these can be used for really fascinating and useful technology like gas membranes, so purifying oxygen out of air for oxygen tanks, or removing salt from ocean water, or even building electronics. So these are just a few. There are many more examples of polymer self-assembly, but here's just a few for you guys to kind of be exposed to. Okay. Now, here's another experiment that I wanted to throw out to you. Again, I wish we could be in person to do this together. But an experiment you can do that's really simple, but where you're actually sort of, not directly, but you're seeing the benefits of self-assembly of polymer molecules in the form of a gel, is making Jello. Okay, you get a Jello packet, and that has polymer molecules in it. And you mix them with warm water. And once you cool it, it forms the jiggly, solid-like material that is Jello. Okay, and here's another term since we're kind of running through a few terms here, gel is a material that's mostly made of water, of liquid, but that acts like a solid. Okay, so in the case of Jello, if you've ever made Jello, if you haven't, you should go do this. You should do this anyways, because this is kind of a neat thing to do to observe molecular self-assembly. But Jello is mostly made of water. There's very little powder that you mix in, which is gelatin, but it behaves like a solid because of a process of self-assembly. Okay, so here's the Jello. This is zoomed in on the molecules. So these would be the polymer chains. And the gelatin molecules actually form interactions with one another that hold the Jello together like a solid. But all this red space you see here is liquid, the liquid water in the Jello. And so when you're actually making Jello, the process that you observe is you mix hot water, and the water's hot enough that it doesn't allow the gelatin molecules to assemble. Okay, so if we put enough energy in, we can break a lot of these self-assemblies. Again, think about melting a polymer or a plastic material going from crystalline to amorphous. So the boiling water breaks up the gelatin molecules, and when you cool it, again, you're stealing the energy back out, and those chains come together, again, forming interchain interactions. So they stick together to one another, and that's why you get a solid. So when you're actually making Jello, you're observing this process on a molecular scale. Something you could, again, expand upon this, if you make, this is obviously a very big Jello. You've seen these big Jello dessert things, but if you make some smaller Jellos, like in plastic cups, you can add different amounts of gelatin or the Jello powder to each one and see how that might affect kind of the behavior or the properties of the Jello you make. Is it really soft? Is it still liquid? Is it a harder or a softer solid? Those are things you could hypothesize about and then observe based on your experiment. Okay. I believe, so this is my last slide before I turn it back to Dean Matta for his section. And I just wanted to give a quick pitch or give you an idea of what I do in my lab here at Bucknell. I work in materials particularly similar to Jello, actually, except I don't care about water. I get rid of water and I use some things like mineral oil, which you can pick up at Walmart. It's for skincare and things like that. But I make my gels from oil instead of water. And a lot of the processes of self-assembly that we've seen change a lot when you remove water from the equation. And so this is some of the this is a picture of what the nanostructure looks like in some of my materials on the right. And really what my students and I are interested in figuring out or examining is how can we change the self-assembled structures through what we add? So that's the formulation, right? The things we add and how much. And once we have self-assembled structures that we can change through what we mix in, how does that affect the mechanical properties? So in other words, how flexible, how soft, how stretchy the things are, and on transport, which is related to something like drug delivery. If we can make a faster transport property, for example, that would mean a faster release of drugs into your body in the example of drug delivery. A slower one would be more like a sustained release, like you might apply a patch, a pharmaceutical patch that would release pharmaceutical compounds into your body over a period of a month or something like that. And again, just to reemphasize the size, this is always something, just like the video, I like to make clear. Here's a picture of one of our gels prepared into a disc. That disc is 25 millimeters in diameter, so this picture is about 50. And then you can compare that a scale 1,000,000 times smaller approximately, where we actually can start to see the self-assembled structures. So there's that. I guess I didn't watch the chat very well, but if anybody has any questions, I didn't put my email here as well. If we don't have the emails in any of the materials for the camp, I'll make sure you guys get that. If you have any questions or you want to follow up about anything, please let me know and enjoy your experimenting. Pat, do you want me to turn the screen sharing over to you for your part? Would that be easiest?
Thank you, Dr. Mineart. Now let me zoom ahead my part, one sec. Okay, so following on what Professor Mineart was talking about, I'll be focused on a related polymeric material that you experience every day, and that is rubber. Rubber is sometimes called elastomers, and you see this in the form of tubing, anything that's squeezy, rubbery, foamy on your bicycle or any sporting equipment, and a little more high tech shown on the right are anything that needs to be flexible for its use. Here's a medical device, and respirator used in hospitals. Those are made of rubber. Now, unlike the gels Dr. Mineart was just talking about, these materials tend to have no water in them and no oil. They're just solid materials, and you can tune the properties by adjusting what's called the cross-link density. So let me tell you a little bit more about that. The way to picture a rubbery material is much like what you saw with the gels. They're long molecules, the red molecules, that are stitched together by cross-links. Those are the black dots. Those are covalent, generally covalent bonds, like a carbon-carbon bond. Now, the distance between cross-links is adjustable. And I've shown, just roughly speaking, 1/100th of a micron, and I'll get into a micron on the next slide. Now, so this is a lot like a soccer net, but shrunk down to the molecular level. And it might seem like this is static and it's not changing with time, but this molecular dynamics simulation I'll show in this movie will show you that actually those cross-link points at any given time, just sitting there, a piece of rubber on the table, they're moving quite a bit. And so this shows how they're moving. So even though you can't see it by eye, if you were able to zoom in on a microscope, an atomic microscope, you would see that the molecules are quite really fluid-like, even though the object itself is a solid. And so as engineers, what we do is we change the properties of the material to suit a particular medical application or sports application by adjusting the chemistry of the red chains and the cross-link density in terms of how many of the black dots are in there in the material. And so just to emphasize a little bit more what the size scale was there, remember I said it was 1/100th of a micron. So a good way to figure out how big a micron is shown in this diagram. If you take a human hair, that's the brown hair here, the diameter of that is about 50 to 100 microns. And so 1 micron is just 1/100th of that. And then the cross-link density was 1/100th of that. So many times smaller. And this particular slide shows the size of other things like pollen, etc. So we're talking small length scales to control the properties, but that's the beauty of chemistry and chemical engineering, is engineers taking advantage of chemistry to manipulate things at the micron and smaller length scale, which is pretty awesome, actually. Now, what we do in my lab is to take rubber and convert it into a material that actually moves. Instead of just sitting there like a piece of plastic that doesn't do anything, my group of students at Bucknell works on plastics, in particular rubbery materials, that respond to heat and to light and to electricity by moving. And so I'll show just a series of a few videos here. This one is a piece of rubber that, upon heating, by putting it on this hot plate, responds by returning from one shape or moving from one shape to another. The next video shows a piece of rubber that has shape memory change color and shape at the same time. And still one more form. This is a microscope image of a coating that has shape memory, where that thing that runs diagonally is actually a scratch. So you can imagine if you get damage to your phone in the form of a scratch, like a rock scratched it, the idea here is that this would be a coating that if you take your hair dryer to it and heat it up, that's what we did in this experiment, the crack will disappear. So this shows the hair dryer heats the material, and it doesn't disappear completely, but it's enough that you can see through the crack without any problem. So we were pretty excited the day that happened in the lab. Now let me switch gears to a design principle. I just have a couple more slides here that connects art and engineering, and this is like the latest, greatest thing going on in robotics, actually. So many of you are familiar with origami. It's the Japanese art of folding paper into decorative shapes. And this particular graphic shows you how to make a bird-like figure by folding paper many times. And if you look online, you can find all sorts of different things you can make if you have patience and you're pretty good with your hands to make fancy objects. Now, what does that have to do with engineering or polymers? Let me tell you how that works. Well, one of my students works on making paper in the lab, and you might not realize it, but if you look really up close at paper, it's actually made up of fibers. But those fibers are squished together so hard that you can't even tell there's fibers there anymore. But the reason you can write with pen on paper is that the fibers wick up the ink to leave a permanent mark. Now, what we do in our group is make paper by this thing shown on the left. It's something called electrospinning. It's basically like controlled lightning. We make a polymer solution, that's polymers dissolved in a liquid, and then we apply a high voltage which discharges in a miniature form of lightning. And what results is that picture in the upper right, it's a piece of paper. And when you look in the microscope, you see that it's a connection or a web of many fibers, each of which, if you look at the scale bar here, is about 1 micron in diameter. So again, about 1/100th of a hair diameter. Now, what's cool about this paper is that it can be forced to fold upon contact with water. So what we did is we cut that paper that has microfibers in it, and then in this somewhat square form or polygonal form. And then what we did is in the movie we'll show, we draw some water lines with a paintbrush in strategic locations and watch what happens. So we call this water origami. And what happens is when you paint the water on there, this is sped up. If you wait a little bit of time, this is just at room temperature, it folds itself precisely at the point where you put the water. And we're very hopeful that this will be a technique to mass produce folded objects, or to trigger objects to fold on purpose, let's say during surgery for a doctor. Now, this is being used not by people like me, I'm a material scientist, but by mechanical engineers that are very interested in robotics. There's now this field that you might be interested in, especially if you go into either electrical or computer or mechanical engineering. There's a field called Origami-Inspired Robots. And this will be my final slide I wanted to show you, where a group in Germany collaborated with a group in the US at MIT to use the sort of techniques I was just talking about to make little miniature robots that fold and then they move. And so this on the right shows the folding pattern, and the movie will show how these objects moved when they were in a magnetic field. So the first thing that happens is this flat object curls up into the robot shape, like a transformer. And then the magnetic field is turned on, and these things just move around like crazy. This is real time. They just move spontaneously and with some control. The engineers out that are running this experiment are driving the movement a little bit by steering with the magnetic field. And it's amazing what these little robots are capable of. They can move things. They can swim. That's sped up a little bit, but much like a spider on top of water. Here's a robot doing some work, moving something, climbing up a hill. And even bulldozing through some things. Looks like it's alive, doesn't it? Now, the reason that origami was important is to make it adopt the right shape that can crawl. And what these scientists and engineers pointed out in their paper and what's shown here is that the whole thing can be recycled by dissolving in water, or in this case, in acetone, which is like nail polish remover. So if you're interested later, you'll have access to these materials. You can check out that video again later. So this is what we went 2 minutes over, but these are the things that Professor Mineart and I wanted to introduce you to. Now there were a lot of there were a lot of details. Mainly, we wanted to convince you that this is pretty cool stuff, very exciting, and things that are going forward in the future. Todd, were you going to say something?
Yep, I was just going to chime in. We did have one quick question in the chat where Matthew was wondering what are some other benefits of the self-moving plastic, as you mentioned, as you were starting to talk about the rubber and everything. I know you gave some examples, but maybe you can give a little bit more for him.
Sure. I'll give 2 examples that are very different in scale. One is deployable satellites. So you can imagine launching something into space, and often what NASA and the Air Force need are these mirrors that open up to be like 50 meters in size, but rockets are not 50 meters in diameter. So you need to make something that's small and compact and then can be deployed, in this case by a laser. Or at the other end of the spectrum, surgeons desire robots for surgery that where these little miniature movers that go around can go all the way to a tumor, for example, to deliver drug where it needs to go without having to steer a wire all the way there. So those are just a couple of applications. Are there any other questions?
I don't know if you saw that, but there was just another one of what exactly is shape memory?
Okay, I could do that. That's shape memory means there are 2 shapes. There could be a permanent shape and a temporary shape. And what shape memory means is that when you add heat, water, or electricity, the material jumps from one shape to the other. And the engineer can prescribe what those 2 shapes are by manufacturing and then by some chemistry. So my favorite example of that shape memory device that we invented is a tiny little tube that goes from less than a millimeter in diameter to about 5 millimeters in diameter when you heat it. And that can be used for heart surgery, where sometimes when somebody has a heart attack, the surgeon needs to open up the arteries in the heart. And that mechanism of increasing the diameter of a little piece of plastic can do just that. So it's really valuable to human health. Jean Jablonski, did you want to say a little bit about what's coming next for our campers?
I would like to give the opportunity for anyone else to ask questions generally. Every session is going to be a little bit different topics, and show you some stuff that you can do at home. I really do encourage you to try some of the things. Many of the faculty that are going to speak to you are going to talk about stuff you can try at home. And these are also kind of introducing you to the idea that you can find some of these videos online, and then you can reach out to any of the instructors that have talked about them, and they'll give you other resources or answer your questions. So I'd really encourage folks to do that. If anybody has any sort of questions related to virtual camp itself, you can throw those in the chat, or you can just, call them out or something like that. But coming back at 1, I know Professor Waka had to jump off the call, but he's got a whole in-lab situation to show you, and he's got some really cool videos and some really cool demonstrations. And he welcomes people like Dean Mather and Professor Mineart into his lab to do research on materials like this. So if there are no other questions, I'll hang out for a few minutes, and then we'll see you back at 1 o'clock.
Thank you all for coming.